Hi, my name is Nathan Hobson. I'm an associate professor at the University of Bergen, Norway, and the founder and organizer of the Japan Roundtable podcast, which is sponsored in part by the Toshiba International Foundation. This is our second episode, in which we present a discussion of the challenges of teaching and learning about Japan in Japan, especially in EMI, or English Medium Instruction Courses and Programs. In this episode, Yanis Gaitanidis, who is an associate professor at Chiba University, will moderate a panel with Professor Sachiko Horiguchi of Temple University's Japan campus, Professor Gregory Poole of Doshisha University, and Associate Professor Satoko Shao Kobayashi of Chiba University. Based on their experience in diverse institutional contexts, the host and guests will address a number of the most salient issues facing Japanese studies in Japan today, including, for example, the nebulous and shifting terms international or kokusai Japanese studies and the realities of translanguaging in the classroom, as well as the significance of generational change in the scholars and educators involved in these efforts. 公益財団法人東芝国際交流財団のご提供でお届けする Japan Roundtable の第2エピソードでは、日本における日本研究の課題と、そしてその対応についてもお話をいただきます。私は、ノルウェー国立ベルゲン大学准教授のホブソンと申します。どうぞよろしくお願いいたします。今回、千葉大学のヤニス・ガイタニディス准教授がホストを務め、テンプル大学ジャパンキャンパスの堀口幸子教授、同志社大学のグレゴリー・プール教授、そして千葉大学の小林幸子准教授の3名のパナリストをお迎えします。多様な経験や経歴に基づき、国際日本研究の国際という呆然とした概念、日本研究の教育現場におけるトランスランゲージングという現実、そしてこうした取り組みに携わる学者や教育者の世代交代の意義など、今日の日本における日本研究教育が直面するいくつかの重要課題について意見を交わします。
Right. Hi, everyone. This is one of the Toshiba International Foundation podcasts. My name is Yanis Gaitanidis. We're here today with my colleagues, Sachiko Horiguchi, Gregory Poole, and Satoko Shao Kobayashi, to talk about navigating the challenges of Japanese studies pedagogy at universities in Japan. Before we move on into more detailed self-introductions, including the details of our institutions, I would like to just explain a bit how we came up with this topic. So perhaps some of you know that more than 15 years ago, the Japanese Ministry of Education started the Global 30 project, which encouraged universities in Japan to accept more international students, and was followed by a series of other projects that led to an increase in English medium instruction, the so-called EMI, and also to newly designed English taught programs, the ETP, and the hiring of many scholars with doctoral degrees from non-Japanese institutions. So during this long period of more than 15 years, the term Kokusai Nihongaku, sometimes translated as International Japanese Studies, other times as Global Japanese Studies, became a sort of floating signifier for several types of Japanese studies curricula offered either as standalone study programs or as embedded programs in a variety of liberal arts and area studies degrees. This podcast, and with my colleagues today, aims to discuss several challenges that these conditions have raised in terms of what it means to teach Japanese studies in Japan in these conditions, and how are the challenges that we face in our divergent institutions today. So with no further ado, I just would like to, first of all, introduce the speakers today. So I will be the moderator. I'm Yanis Gaitanidis from Chiba University. Was born in Greece, but I did my undergraduate degree and postgraduate degrees in Japanese studies in the UK. I have been teaching at Chiba University since 2013, and with my colleague who is here today, Satoko Shao Kobayashi, and others at this university, we developed originally a Japanese studies curriculum that was meant for students across faculties at Chiba University. Then 3 years later, so in 2016, we joined the newly founded Liberal Arts and Sciences College, which in English is translated as Kokusai Kyoyo Gakubu, where we also teach Japan-related classes, but there will be more about this by my colleague Satoko later on. Before that, let me pass the mic to Sachiko for her self-introduction.
Thank you very much, Yanis, and thank you for giving me this great opportunity to join you for an exciting discussion. So I'm Sachiko Horiguchi from Temple University Japan campus, based in Tokyo. I'm originally from Tokyo, Japan, and I've been trained in social anthropology of Japan in a postgraduate program in the UK. I have done long-term research on hikikomori, or socially isolated individuals in Japan, and have taught anthropology of Japan courses here in Japan. At Temple University Japan campus, I teach Japan courses as part of an Asian studies major, and I've been doing that since 2010. And in our program, we have students majoring in Asian studies, as well as students from various majors, from international business to communications, taking courses on Japan with me. At Temple University Japan campus, or TUJ as we call it, all courses are conducted in English, except for the Japanese language courses offered. And this means that there's no Japanese language required for our students enrolling in our institution. Our student body is diverse. We have 30 to 40% American students, 30% Japanese. Some of them have been educated fully in Japan, while others have been educated in international schools or have been abroad, being returnee, and also some others having transferred from community colleges in the US, etc. And then we have students from 80 different countries. The students come, therefore, with varied levels of Japanese and also exposure to Japan. Some students are here just for one semester on study abroad programs, while many others are Japan admit students that would be spending at least 3-4 years here in Japan as well. The Japanese students do come from quite varied backgrounds and share with us quite varied language levels and, again, knowledge of Japan as well. Now I'll move on to ask Greg to follow me with their introduction.
Great. Thank you, Sachiko. Yeah, I'm very excited to be here with you and Yanis and Satoko today. I'm originally from the US, grew up in New York. I did my undergraduate degree at 2 different liberal arts programs in the US. My graduate work I did in the UK. I was trained in social anthropology, and I've done ethnographic work in higher education, at preschool, and also translanguaging is one of my recent projects. I've been a permanent member of academic staff at 4 different universities in Japan, both private and national. In 2011, I moved from Tsukuba to Doshisha to help as a core faculty member at the newly established, at the time, Institute for the Liberal Arts, or ILA as we call it, which was part of the G30 initiative that Yanis spoke about. Like in Sachiko's case, the ILA is an ETP, and our major is liberal arts. So we're not a Japanese studies program, and we have no Japanese language requirement. One sort of confusing fact about our program is that we are in between 6 different gakubu. So our students are each shozoku, or placed into one of the gakubu, but all of their pedagogy, all of the administration of the program is done through the Institute for the Liberal Arts. 30 or 40% of our students, I would say, just estimating, have some sort of Japanese heritage or some sort of connection to Japan. They might have family in Japan. They've been to Japan during their summer vacations, but they have never lived here. Other students are totally bilingual. I would say that multilingualism really is the norm at the ILA, since we have people who are first-time residents of Japan, but also long-term residents. And I would say over 45 different passports have been represented at any one time at the ILA. So I'll pass the mic then on to Satoko.
Hi, I'm Satoko Shao Kobayashi, and I'm born and raised in Japan. But I was trained in linguistic anthropology in education in the US. And I taught Asian American studies there for 6 years in the US and came back to Japan to work at Chiba University and teaching Japanese studies courses there within the framework of general education. So Chiba University is a national university. Most of the students are locally grown, but we are pushing the internationalization of the university. So we have a lot of international students and then pushing local students to study abroad, etc. So the Japanese studies courses that I teach, I use both Japanese and English, and some of the courses are taught only in English. So the Japanese studies here we are doing is a series of collaborative learning classes for home and international students. So it's not an area study, so to speak. So there are some interesting sort of confusing facts about our university on Japanese studies. So we have a lot of international students. The exchange program for incoming international students is separated into Japanese studies, Nihon Kenkyu, for rather advanced Japanese speakers. But the other one is for Japanese language learner, beginner level, the Japanese language speakers, and that's called liberal arts, Kokusai Kyoyo. So that's for an international students program. But there is also a university-wide minor called Kokusai Nihongaku, which university translate as a global Japanese studies. And then the college that Yanis and I are in are called Kokusai Kyoyo. The English translation that they put is that liberal arts and sciences. And within this college that we work for, there is a contemporary Japanese studies, a Gendai Nihongaku major. So that's one of the three majors that we have within the college. So yeah, that's pretty confusing. But anyways, so what is Japanese studies is a big question to us. So yes, I'm very looking forward to this conversation today. Thank you.
Thank you, Satoko, and everyone for these introductions. And hopefully listeners can understand that we have basically three different institutional contexts represented today. So we have a public or national university where Japanese studies is explicitly offered as a minor within a curriculum open to all undergraduate departments, the EMI, but also within departmental curricula in liberal arts. We have a private university, Dosha University, right, where Japanese studies courses are offered implicitly within a generalized liberal arts curriculum taught in English, so an ETP. And we also have an American university where, again, we have an ETP where Japanese studies courses are embedded in a specialized area studies undergraduate curriculum. So a different context, but we identified at least three challenges. And with no further ado, I would like to start the conversation on the first challenge that we identified, and which has to do precisely with this word kokusai. So when we discussed about this in advance of the podcast, we thought that there are questions arisen as to how student audiences and class content have actually complicated the meaning of the word kokusai, which is now a multivocal word, when it is employed as a signifier for Japanese studies, for liberal arts, and also for many top-down strategies of internationalization at our higher education institutions. So each of us will share our thoughts on this, and the first speaker for this, I think we decided was Satoko.
Okay, so yeah, I just talked about how Japanese studies has multiple meanings within our university, but international is also, we have a lot of different definitions, I feel like. So Chiba University, as I mentioned, has been pushing the internationalization largely because of the government special funding that we always need to seek in order to keep going, the hires and the classes and all that funding the university needs. So kokusai, so we called it kokusai before because it was how the government, Ministry of Education called it kokusai. And then now we are saying it's global for the past decade. And that's what we use in our university as well. What's funny is that I was hired as a foreign faculty member. Like I said, I'm from Japan, but because I received a degree overseas, they put me in this category of a foreign faculty member because it helps universities internationalization, right? Kokusaika, that helps, to earn their points. So anyway, the word kokusai and global are used very interchangeably. One of the symbolic examples is Kokusai Nihongaku, a university-wide minor that's translated as Global Japanese Studies, as I mentioned. Whereas undergraduate college, Kokusai Kyoyo Gakubu, is translated as Liberal Arts and Sciences. So there's no international or global when we translate liberal arts, the Kokusai Kyoyo Gakubu. They omit the word international or global to the name. So, and then we also have a graduate program, Sogo Kokusai Gakui program, that's also pushed by the Ministry of Education's push. And that's also translated as Graduate Degree Program of Global and Transdisciplinary Studies. So yeah, there's a lot of non-translated kokusai and translated kokusai into international and global and all that. That's a bit confusing, right? I mean, like, Yanis, you are in the same university. I think you have more to say to it.
Right. Yeah. I mean, there is a lot of meanings in global, right? Not just even in Japanese, but even within English, perhaps the global can mean various things. And in regards to how Japan is as a pedagogical frame is implemented, the global also changes its meaning. And that is quite interesting when we look at what you've just mentioned across the university, whether Japanese studies is implemented as a cross-faculty curriculum or whether it is inside a department's curriculum. The global even changes as much meaning as the Japanese studies. So it is often the case that programs become global because there is a Japan-related classes involved or included in them. So implicitly, this notifies students that we have Japan-related classes. So obviously, the rest of the classes are not Japan-related. Maybe it's not obvious, but sometimes it implicitly means that. So in combination with the rest of the components of this curriculum, we have something that looks global. So in our case, the case of our college, which is called Kokusai Kyoyo Gakubu, but in English it's Liberal Arts and Sciences, we have a minor that is, as you mentioned at the start, Contemporary Japanese Studies, and we also have another minor, which is Global Studies. The problem, as I see it, right, I mean, it's methodological. So on one hand, we have a Japanese studies component, which we have to take as a starting point. But by taking Japanese as a kind of given, we lose the sort of globality of the content. And on the other hand, which is also more interesting, is we also lose the potential of the adjective global, which instead of meaning something, everything or worldwide or Japan and the rest, could be actually, and is actually used in our classes, Satoko's and mine and other colleagues, in more precise terms, in terms of global interactions or exchanges or mutual influences. And I think that's perhaps something that more liberal arts types of departments are keen on. And perhaps Greg has more to say about this.
Yes, well, what Satoko and Yanis are relating has lots of parallels at Doshisha as well. We struggled in the beginning to sort of disentangle our institute from the international. So the I of institute from this I of international. Since originally our name had been designated by the university administration as Kokusai Kyoiku Institute, okay, Instituto. And so Kokusai Kyoiku we felt problematic because we're not an educational studies degree. And also we didn't really want to focus on the sort of kokusai, the international. That was the norm. And so we wanted our students to be accepted as doshisha students and not as ryugakusei or international students. And there were some quirks that came out of this. We even had one incident where some of the institute students were not invited to a party because it was only for international students, and they happened to have a Japanese passport. In the beginning, we had to sort all of this out, and the university was very helpful with this. But we might think, though, about what international means, right? We're talking about this multivocal symbol of kokusai, right, of international. And I tend to think that it's sort of a gloss for innovative, like we should read it as innovation or innovative. And I think the MEXT is often thinking of international programs as perhaps ways to help universities innovate. On the other hand, there's constraints that we have in terms of the curriculum, in terms of the content. For example, we might think about how our students are still kind of under the thumb of the vestigial year-long coursework curriculum, where we didn't have semesters in Japan. It wasn't that long ago at Japanese universities that we didn't have semester systems. So that meant that when you enrolled in a class, that class met for the whole academic year. Now that we've divided into semesters, it means logistically that actually students, they have to average more than 8 classes a semester, sometimes 10 or 12 even, to sort of graduate on time. So I tend to feel the coursework is sort of a huge burden for students, since it takes away from their time to actually study, if you will, because they're in class so much, right? Or I like how in Britain, you don't major in something, you read for a degree, right? It means that you have time to actually go to the library and read, right? Or maybe not the library these days, but just to sort of summarize, I think our international programs are in some ways prevented from being as innovative as they could be, largely because of next requirements that are going to take time to change, or at least interpretations or invocations of these requirements that our universities have sort of taken on as their position, right, in terms of kokusai-kan. So I'm really curious to hear how our examples at Japanese universities, Japanese institutions, compare with what Sachiko has to say about TUJ.
Yes, thanks, Greg. Indeed, my university, Temple University Japan campus, is rather unique, and it positions itself in that way because we are an American institution providing an American university degree. But here in Japan, we position ourselves as what we call, quote, truly global institution, with the assumption that these Japanese universities are struggling in truly globalizing, and that globalization might be somewhat limited in Japanese universities. And the context that I think Yanis, Satoko, and Greg explained shows these struggles that might certainly be there. And we say that we're providing a kind of truly international education for all students coming from all over the world, including, of course, a big number of American students who come to study in Japan. And for them, the Japanese experience becomes something of an international global experience of some sort. Having said this, does American make it global? Of course, is an important question. And being trained in anthropology, I am, as a faculty member that teaches anthropology to students, I do have to be somewhat critical about this American imperialism that plays out perhaps in our institution. There actually are a number of faculty who come from all over the world, and not necessarily from the United States, which makes it somewhat critical of the American centrism in our institution, but we still are American. So we need to unpack this assumption that, for example, speaking English might have to do with being global or international. What if our American students don't pick up as much Japanese as we wish because we don't run a program that requires Japanese, for example? And these are questions that I think are quite important to address in thinking about how we might think about a global, international in an anthropological sense, and challenging Anglocentrism, American centrism. Another challenge that we have is that because we're so unique, we also are struggling to make connections and also have impact on Japanese higher education. Although I think we are making better efforts, we have much more partnerships with local prefectures, etc., than before. But rather than trying to connect with their sense of global, like Chiba or Doshisha, we try to say that we are different is the common rhetoric that we have. I guess the next conversation might be about language. Yanis?
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, as you already pointed out, this idea that American universities or everything is supposed to be taught in English and everyone is supposed to be almost native speaker, whereas at our universities, we are supposed to have only Japanese native speakers. But as I think Greg also mentioned, this is definitely not the case, at least not anymore. And therefore, we have to deal with another of the challenges. This is our second challenge, which is the reality in class. So even if perhaps Japanese language is being traditionally associated with Japanese studies, and English language also to some extent problematically associated with internationalization. The reality in class is that there is a translanguaging happening, and students don't necessarily use these languages in a way that the curriculum requires from them. So could you say a bit more about this in the case of the American university, where the frame looks more defined but might not be? Sachiko.
Thanks. Yes, as I mentioned earlier, we operate as an American university, and we do try to sort of create an all-English sort of atmosphere actually on campus. So not just within classes, actually, but also in the faculty conversations with students outside of class, etc. We're supposed to be using English all throughout, except again for the Japanese language teachers. So this English language requirement on campus is there that discourages maybe translanguaging, although of course in an official sense, although of course the students come from quite multilingual backgrounds. Actually, we have students from 80 different countries, and for many of them English is not their first language, but English kind of dominates, I would say, on our campus. Informally, of course, students might talk in their own languages, might code switch, but on my side, for example, even if I'm talking with a Japanese student, I'm supposed to be doing everything in English. And that poses challenges when we try to teach Japan, because inevitably our teaching becomes Anglo-centric. For example, I cannot assign readings in Japanese, although I can recommend those. And I do think that this is a problem when we try to encourage students to learn about Japan, with a caveat that they can only use maybe English language sources. And as I mentioned earlier, as an anthropologist, this English imperialism, American imperialism is something that we hope to challenge. I do bring that into my own classroom, but this is not something that's always shared across the university. So it's a local challenge of some sort that I try to bring into the classroom, which I think our students appreciate because of, again, like our students actually come from many non-American backgrounds, quite a few of them, majority of them indeed. So what about the situation at Doshisha, Greg? How do you see the translanguaging?
So we don't quite have the same explicit language policy, perhaps, that TUJ has. So I would say that in terms of the hegemony of English in the classroom, that there's different interpretations that different faculty members have around the idea of translanguaging. Some see it as a resource, and it allows students to engage with their entire linguistic repertoire, while others try to prohibit it, thinking that's better for the students because it's a more level playing field, right? But even if it's prohibited, I think even the lecturers, the instructors themselves, fall into code switching inadvertently. So we have the funny case where, we did, students did a little bit of research on their own classroom experience, and they realized that there was a bit of a gap in what was being ideologically proposed and what was actually being practiced. So, which is not surprising. So we have some different pedagogy styles, I would say, but on the other hand, there's a very high level of language competence required to actually enter our program. I would say on average, most of our students have at least 100 on the TOEFL, so they're very bilingual. And I think there's rarely confluence of teaching English as a second language, as an L2, with the teaching in English, right? So we're certainly a program that we teach in English, and there's really very little misunderstanding, even among students coming into our program, because in their interview, if they say, "Oh, I want to improve my English," we quickly say, that's not the point of our program. So I think there is pretty much a common understanding in that from that perspective. And finally, just to think about the Japanese as a second language, in our program, although we strongly encourage it as a subject, I would say that practically speaking, because of the intense nature of the credit requirements to graduate and the very stringent demands that we place on our students in terms of coursework, that practically speaking, most students aren't able to put the time into studying Japanese that they perhaps had hoped to, which is a little bit of a challenge that we have. it's hard to justify in their eyes sometimes formal language studies because they only get one credit as well for language classes, which is half the number of credits they get for other classes. Even though there's certainly not half the, as any of us who've taken second languages know, it's not an easy subject. How does this relate then to the situation at Chiba, would you say, Yanis?
As you mentioned, the Japanese studies, originally this idea of Kokusai Nihongaku was almost necessarily attached to English language learning, implicitly or explicitly. And it was the case for us as well. So when we originally developed this minor for Japanese studies, and which was supposed to target students from all departments at the university, the main kind of objective was that the students would come and learn about Japan in English. So it was a package, let's say. And as always, packages are very difficult to manage and control and actually succeed. So the idea that we have Chiba University students, or home students if you want, who are supposed to know about Japan and then take the same class in English with international students who are supposed to know more English but less about Japan, already from the start didn't really work, because a lot of the students who come have some sort of Japanese studies training. Some of them come from Japanese studies departments. So in the conversations, they sometimes happen to know or seem to know more about Japanese society or politics than the home students, which then turned these classes into very difficult for the native Japanese speakers, because then is the double disadvantage where they seem to know less and also have to use English languages. For us, the fortunate thing was that from the start, we had this also directive to try to develop, and we did with Satoko, courses where the teacher uses both languages and all the information is provided in both languages, so that there is at least a fairness in a sense based on the material that is provided. And of course, students are free to use any of those languages and more, as Satoko will probably talk about in a moment. So there are ways to turn this around, and I think we have in some ways succeeded in this at Chiba University. Perhaps, Satoko, you can share more about this.
Right. There is definitely something that went well, and then also some struggles, as Yanis mentioned, especially because Ministry of Education and Chiba University always seem to believe English equals internationalization and globalization. And then I am also part of the fantasy, because I can only use Japanese and English. I feel bad because I try to learn Spanish and I try to learn Mandarin. It didn't really stick, but I'm still trying. In class, I do explain to my students that it is my limitation and not students. I can only do classes in Japanese and English. And then because sometimes, as Yanis mentioned, students feel that they are incapable because of the language, but they're not. And then even ask how much score do I need to participate in this class or study abroad program, etc., or how much English do I need to know. And a lot of the times they are so concerned about English language level, and then that becomes a huge mental hurdle for them. And on the other hand, sometimes there's a student who can speak English fluently and then become a hijacker of a group discussion and not really giving a floor to other students. Like Yanis and I been trying to work on is that how can we make a fair, sort of safe environment for students to share their ideas, and not so much about proper language proficiency per se, but then conveying the idea using different kind of communicative methods. We use a lot of visuals. Like we have good and bad, but then that's how we reflect our own language and that share with students. And that's what we try to do in our classes.
And as you mentioned, I mean, a lot of this has to do with the fact that we are not native English speakers either, right? So the fact that a lot of our faculty teach in English without having been themselves English learners solves some of the issues, but also obviously creates new challenges, how to frame this for prospective students. Sachiko, you would like to mention something?
Yes, I did want to sort of note what Satoko mentioned about how the English speakers or the speakers who are confident in English, can sometimes take over conversations. And then like those who don't speak English as the first language feel a little bit inferior. And I do spot that our own institution may be even stronger because English again dominates more in our program. And I think the US trained students are encouraged to speak up, and maybe students from elsewhere might feel like they're not good enough. When we look at what they produce, they do very well. But I do try to bring in an extra kind of element of the points that Yanis, you just mentioned about like how many of us are not first language speakers. And I encourage the American students to think about like, what if this class was all in Japanese? How would you survive the situation? It is a hypothetical question I try to ask them. As educators, we do, I think, have to look at this in a critical light.
No, you're right. I mean, and especially in the sense, I mean, it's not just the variety of our backgrounds. It becomes a kind of a strategy to improve our classes, right? And it's not just the language, it's also our disciplinary backgrounds. I mean, just among the four of us, I'm the only one who has a Japanese studies degree. And it's often the case at, I think, a lot of Japanese universities that many people don't have a background in Japanese or area studies. And that's a good thing, which is, this leads us to the third challenge, because we think that this variety of disciplines and backgrounds of the faculty members who teach Japanese studies or end up teaching the Japanese studies at the universities in Japan has helped us overcome issues associated with what we call the Japan explainers. And perhaps Satoko can say a bit more about this.
The Japan explainer is such a great, terminology. Most of our students, home students, went through education in Japan, and that's based on the national curriculum. And especially after the revision of the Basic Act of Education in 2006, which strengthened government involvement in education policies, one of the big emphasis is on our Japanese tradition and culture. So it's sort of essentialized the image of Japan. So whereas many faculty members teaching Japanese studies at our university receive education in English-speaking countries in different disciplines. This is particularly true because being able to give a lecture and publish in English are the crucial decisive factor for new hires, especially funding and all that. That has something to do with universities and rankings and evaluation, and that has something to do with allotment of national funding. So it's so much more complicated. So when I was told to teach Japanese studies, and my background is not Japanese studies, like Yanis mentioned, and then also because I have some background in anthropology, what do you mean by Japan is first thing that came out, right? Japanese studies, do I teach about Japan? I can't teach about Japan. I don't know what Japan is. That was a long conversation that Yanis was really patient. We discussed days and days about that. And then we were thinking like what Japanese studies is and what Japanese stands for and what we envision for our Japanese studies would be or should be. So teachers with different disciplines do not necessarily have the same understanding per se. So we ended up, we should just focus on using Japan as an example, teach basic concept in our speciality and not to teach what Japan is per se. So that was one of the things that kept us moving with our program. How is it in Doshisha, Greg?
Yes, what you just mentioned, Satoko, it really resonates with what we have come up with. And that is, we're teaching the liberal arts through the lens of Japan. So we're not teaching what Japan is, but we're using Japan as an example. Exactly. That being said, and we do have Japan explainers. So not everybody buys into that necessarily. And even though a large portion of our faculty have experience outside of Japan, so they have experience to not only Nihonjin views, but the sort of antithesis to that, I think quickly it's our students that challenge us, right? So if we come up with a phrase that sounds rather suspicious to our students, sensei, isn't that Nihonjin-ron? So they have the tools. We try to give them the tools to unpack assumptions about Japan. And it's very exciting when they actually use those tools in the classroom to challenge us when we either purposefully or inadvertently fall into a Japan explainer sort of mode of operandum. And I would say that even though our program is not Japanese studies, as I've mentioned, again, the mode of inquiry is to use Japan as a lens. And there's certainly many different interpretations of what Japanese studies is at the ILA. Our center of ideological gravity, to sort of sum up, would be this sort of multivocal notion of Japan, inverted commas, challenging us then to explain Japan, or not explain Japan, but rather to focus on ways to interpret, right? So not explaining Japan, but interpreting Japan is really where our center of gravity is implicitly or explicitly inhabited, not only by us, but by our students, to reiterate. They seem to laugh off attempts, again, by some instructors to sort of explain Japan. So maybe I'll give the mic to Yannis.
Yeah, I mean, the critical perspective, this is something we've been doing it at Chiba U also for a long while, to the point that we have renamed our Japanese studies methods critical Japanese studies. But it's also funny that since we've been doing this for so long, we also have had now students expecting it in our classes, and perhaps more than we are actually engaged into it. So we have people now expecting us to criticize Japanese stereotypes in every single class that we do. And perhaps that also is a good reaction to it. But on the other side, those teachers who do not take that particular approach, or do not pick on every stereotype they hear from the students in class, may seem then, in comparison to us, more lenient or even, dare I say, more open-minded, in inverted commas. So there is an interesting, let's say, context here where we also have been engaged in the past in doing faculty development seminars to try to share our methods, so that we are not the only, let's say, group of teachers who explicitly engage with criticizing stereotypes in our classes. So in the end, thinking from that perspective, their classes are called Japanese studies, but they're basically methodologies classes. So we try to, as you, I think, mentioned before, Greg, the idea of how do you overcome these essentialist discourses, and if methodological nationalism doesn't work, what other ways are there to think about these topics, and how to understand nationalistic tendencies in order to subvert them with more innovative and collaborative strategies that Satoko mentioned earlier. So that's, I think, the big difference with the Japan explainers, is that the Japan explainers usually don't talk about methodology in class or how they came up with these explanations, and we do. And I think that's the big difference. What do you think, Sachiko?
I do share the kinds of, I think, concerns, experiences, although I think our program is kind of unique. Now, I would agree, I think, with most of the points that you have mentioned. So in our program, most faculty in Asian studies, where Japan courses are taught, promote critical, nuanced understanding of Japan, I think, from various disciplinary perspectives, maybe political science, history, literature, religion, etc. And we do think that our program, or like the way we teach Japan, should be different from how Japan is taught in mainland US, or like, let's say, our main campus in Philadelphia, although the titles of our courses are going to be the same, because the students do live in Japan. And I think we do take the idea that we should really sort of have a bottom-up understanding of what happens in Japan. Challenging stereotypes, as everybody said, I think is something that we, I think, all try to promote. So our program incorporates a mix of anthropological, sociological, historic, literature-based religious approaches. Plus, I think there's a number of faculty doing political science, etc., and also economy and things like that. The Asian studies major sort of operates in an interdisciplinary way. But having said this, there are a lot of students outside of the Asian studies major that really like to take Japan courses because they just simply want to learn about Japan because they are here. But that poses another challenge because they might not get the holistic sort of interdisciplinary kind of understanding that the students in Asian studies majors would get. So there's a bit of a limitation there. And also another challenge that we find is that there's nobody, I think, in the Asian studies program that are trained in Japanese graduate school. So they're all trained sort of overseas, typically in the West. And many faculty don't engage much with Japanese or maybe local academic communities. And I'm one of the few faculty that's connected to these Japanese academic communities and also publish in Japanese as well. So we do stay a bit in a bubble. So there's a strong American smell that I think we can find when we go into a building and everything is going to be in English. And that bubble is also affecting the way that we struggle to make connections with local Japanese institutions or Japanese scholarly communities. And also, fortunately, we don't really discuss that much about the connection between Japanese language courses and the content courses in the Asian Studies program, which I do feel is necessary going forward as well. But these are maybe issues that might be found in English medium sort of Japanese programs in Japan as well as elsewhere. And I hope we can continue to address this issue going forward.
Thank you for this. So we almost reaching an hour for this podcast, and we won't stay longer. But talking about bubbles, we hope that this conversation will also reach people beyond Japan. The discussion about navigating the challenges of Japanese studies pedagogy definitely go beyond what we experience at Japanese institutions. And we hope that actually many of those who will listen to this podcast will be nodding along, even if they are not teachers in Japanese institutions, and even if they are not teaching in liberal arts or Japanese studies curricula. If anything, it seems that today, more than ever, world events and the rise of AI-generated content ask us to talk with our students more about methodology and the basic ethics of searching for appropriate information and building an argument around it rather than the content of the argument itself, even if the argument obviously is as important. It seems also that the methods of how arguments are built, are produced, are not self-evident, or at least not anymore, perhaps, and therefore all content must be accompanied by a record of the path that led to it. Some of the publications that we have recommended in the list of sources accompanying this podcast, I hope, offer ideas on how to do this. Thanks again to my colleagues who joined me today, and thanks for listening.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you for your time today. It was a pleasure.